All right, good morning, everybody. Back for another episode of Pick and Pop. Hopefully, everybody enjoyed their weekend as we had plenty of action going on this weekend. The conclusion of the conference quarterfinals in the NBA. There were certainly some great games that went on, and two game sevens that we got to see, which is really nice. And there's certainly a lot that's happened since the last video. Of course, there were the three game sixes of Friday night. That was Toronto defeating Washington. They have moved on. They'll be playing the Cleveland Cavaliers. Game one of that game, that series, I should say, I believe is tomorrow night. Yeah, it'll be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central. So that should be a really exciting series between Cleveland and Toronto. Also on that Friday night, it was the Utah Jazz advancing over the Oklahoma City Thunder despite Russell Westbrook having 19 field goals on 43 shots. He was 7-19 from three in that game. But Paul George and Carmelo Anthony combined for a pedestrian 12 points. That certainly did not help the Thunder's case in attempting to stretch that to 7. So Utah moved on, and they ended up playing the Houston Rockets, and they are down 1-0 in that conference semifinal series. And then Saturday night was game 7 between the Celtics and the Bucks. That was Boston advancing over Milwaukee. And also on that Friday, Indiana stretched their series with Cleveland to 7 games. And Cleveland ended up taking care of business yesterday in what was a really exciting game. And that's kind of what I'll go to now. I'll talk a little bit about the Celtics game 7 a bit later. But this was the game 7 with all of the attention on it. Of course, a big reason for that being is that LeBron James has never even faced elimination in the first round. He was facing that yesterday. And this is an Indiana Pacers team. I thought the series personally would be over in 5 games. I didn't anticipate Cleveland struggling this much. And I think that's really what it has been. I don't think I really underestimated the Pacers, especially because of how well they played against Cleveland for most of the year. I think I overestimated Cleveland because really throughout this entire series. Now, I do have to give a lot of credit to Tyronn Lue, who Tristan Thompson was not really playing at all in this series, had limited minutes. He played 35 minutes yesterday, had 15 points and 10 rebounds. And I don't understand what took him so long to make that move, considering that this is a guy that is familiar with the team, familiar with the situation, has had really, really big games in the playoffs before, and they were in need of a big performance, especially a big man that could help neutralize Miles Turner a lot better. And between Miles Turner and Domantas Sabonis, who split time, they combined for 18 points and 9 rebounds. So between the two of them, I think you got to be pretty happy with that, how that turned out, especially because when the Pacers were winning games in the series, a lot of it was due to Domantas Sabonis and what he was able to bring to the table off of the bench. As far as Indiana, their backcourt was actually going in this game. Victor Oladipo, 30 points, 12 rebounds to go with 6 assists and 3 steals. Darren Collison had 23 points as well. Thaddeus Young, 14 points and 10 rebounds, but none of it was enough to stop the King. 45, 9, and 7 with 4 steals, 16 for 25 from the field, 2 for 3 from 3, and 11 for 15 at the line. And the Cavaliers win the series 4-3, get themselves in a conference semifinal matchup with the Toronto Raptors for the 2nd straight year. It's a 3rd straight year that they are meeting in the postseason in general, and it should be a really good series. I do think that Toronto certainly got a challenge, perhaps more than what they were anticipating from the Washington Wizards. But I think that this Cleveland team overall is worse than the Wizards. I just think it's about how well can they neutralize LeBron James? Can they neutralize him enough to beat the Cavaliers 4 times in 7 tries? And I do think that the answer to that question is yes. I think that if anything's been demonstrated in the first round, it's that every game that Cleveland's won in that series, they were all close games, the ones that Cleveland won. Indiana won the blowout matchups. Cleveland needed everything in the tank from LeBron James in all 4 games that they won. And they were still very close games within 10 points. So I think when you take that into consideration and seeing where the Pacers finish in the Eastern Conference and knowing that the Toronto Raptors are simply a much better team, I would even stretch to say it's going to be extremely difficult. And you can get the average of 40 points a game from LeBron James. But if the Cavaliers are going to win the series, I don't think it has anything to do with LeBron. I think that you know what you're going to get out of LeBron James. I think if the Cavaliers have a chance of winning the series, they're going to need a lot more from Kevin Love. They're going to need a lot more from Kyle Korver. They're going to need J.R. Smith to hit a shot. They're going to need the guys that have been there before on that team to really make a difference, because I think when you look back at the trade that was made in February and how, it's revamping the team, it's taking all these, these conflicting personalities and these egos, and it's, getting rid of them. And, we're going to have a young team and all get on the same page. And it really looked good. Of course, everybody remembers that game that they played in Boston where it was a blowout win. And then, you fast forward a couple of months into the playoffs, and yeah, they skated by a series, but I don't think that switch was ever flipped by the rest of the team. I think it certainly was for LeBron, but they are really going to have their hands full if they're trying to beat the Toronto Raptors, who, especially with Fred VanVleet in the mix, they're just too deep. I think it's just going to be really tough for a team that doesn't have really any star power outside of LeBron and Kevin Love to be able to counter what Toronto's bringing to the table, not just when their star-studded backcourt is on the floor, but when their bench is on the floor. It's not just about containing Lowry and DeRozan like it was in the past, or even Jonas Valanciunas, because Jakob Poeltl's been such a big part for Toronto in keeping the five solid when Valanciunas is on the bench. And then, of course, there's all the weapons that they have outside of Fred VanVleet, who's gotten the most attention this year. But it's Pascal Siakam, it's CJ Miles, it's DeLon Wright. It's these guys that on any given night can score 20 points off the bench and really put you in a tough position to win a game. And then you have a guy like Serge Ibaka in the starting lineup, to where if he gets going offensively, it becomes essentially impossible to beat them, even if you do have LeBron James being LeBron James in that sense. So I'm excited for the series, but I think the Raptors will win it in 6. I just don't foresee the Cleveland Cavaliers having enough to keep up with that team throughout a 7-game series. They barely were able to do it against Indiana. And Indiana was the better team. I think if you're looking at the team as a whole, I think that the Pacers were the better team in that matchup, and that LeBron James really did just win that series. So I'm not incredibly confident about Cleveland's chances in the next round, but of course, you can't count them out. You can't count anything that LeBron James is doing as out and over with. So it'll really be exciting to see how that transpires. And then there was game 1 of the conference semis between the Jazz and the Rockets yesterday. A big reason why I wanted Oklahoma City to win, I was obviously really hyped on them. I thought that they would be able to flip that switch. Outside of Russell Westbrook, they just didn't. But a big reason why I wanted OKC to win is because I really liked the way that they match up with the Houston Rockets. I liked watching them play each other in the regular season. I felt that offensively, if they had their guys going, that they had enough to counter what Houston brings to the table, and that defensively, they match up really well. But Utah, while they're a really good defensive team, doesn't really match up well per se with the Rockets. The reason I thought the Thunder did defensively is because you have a guy like Paul George who's elite and can guard James Harden and can kind of neutralize that. And defensively, their backcourt was strong. Russell Westbrook, a very tough matchup for Chris Paul. But when you put the Jazz in that situation, especially without Ricky Rubio, who is one of the better defenders at the one guard in the league, you really don't have anybody that size to match up with James Harden or Chris Paul. And James Harden had a field day yesterday for that reason, ended up scoring 41 points. But, Donovan Mitchell, of course, isn't at that level yet. Of course, I think he is offensively. I think offensively he's just about as good as any 2-guard in the league. But defensively, of course, is going to need a lot of time to develop. And I think yesterday that became clear because he was facing a guy that is unguardable by really any standpoint. And it really becomes even more difficult when you're trying to have a rookie who's in a really, really intimidating situation in the second round of the playoffs, trying to guard him for the first time. So I think Utah's really going to have their hands full in this series. I think especially if they're without Ricky Rubio, it's going to be tough for them to win a game. I did think the OKC matched up better against them, but I think Utah just offensively doesn't have the firepower on their own to kind of hang in there with Houston. And defensively, they're strong, but kind of at the wrong positions, while Rudy Gobert can really help neutralize Clint Capella. And while Derek Favors can lock down one of their big men outside shooters, what it's really about when playing the Rockets is, can you limit James Harden and Chris Paul? And the Jazz just don't have the defensive ability to do that. And James Harden's probably going to have a really good game every game in this series. And I think that there's a very, very good chance that the Rockets win this one in 4. There are 2 other conference semi-series we'll have going on. One of them is game 1 starting tonight between the Sixers and the Celtics. Of course, Celtics had that long 7-game series against Milwaukee, ended up coming out with the victory. It was a very exciting series, and one that I think was really vital for the young guys on the Celtics to play in a game 7 in the first round. At home, there's a lot of pressure. All the pressure is on you to win the game. And they got big performances out of the guys they needed it from. I think a big part of this upcoming series is the health of Jaylen Brown. He had a grade 1 hamstring strain in game 7 of that series against Milwaukee. He said that he expects to be ready for tonight. He was actually cleared to play in the second half of that last game. Brad Stevens, especially as the Celtics began to pull away, decided to not put him back in. But I think that, if he's healthy and he's going, this will be a really exciting series. And even if not, I love the way that these 2 teams match up. It's a division matchup. You have a lot of pressure on both teams, especially Philly, who at this point is probably the most talented team in the Eastern Conference left. And they feel like they should really win the series. At the same time, Boston has home court advantage. They've been the better team for most of the year. They're just dealing with all the injuries right now. And they're going to see if they have enough grit to be able to grind out a few wins against this Philadelphia team. And I think especially if you're able to get a split at home, Boston has won in Philly this year. And while Philly just got insanely hot second half of the season, the Celtics didn't have to play them at that time, which will make this matchup really interesting. Boston has been one of the better road teams this year, despite not being able to win in Milwaukee. So I wouldn't count out these 2 teams splitting the first 2 games in Boston and then the first 2 games in Philadelphia. But I think as far as matchups go in this series, Boston's going to have to take a completely different approach because they're not guarding a traditional point guard. You have to worry about Ben Simmons, and you can't have 6'3" Terry Rozier guarding 6'10", 6'11" Ben Simmons. So that's what's going to be interesting. I think we already saw a lot of Al Horford moving out to the perimeter to guard Giannis Antetokounmpo. Same thing with Aaron Baines. I think you might see more Greg Monroe in this series for that reason, that he could perhaps interrupt a lot of Simmons's drives to the basket. And then I think as far as their shooters go, it's just going to have to be a similar approach that they had against Milwaukee as far as trying to limit guys like Robert Covington and JJ Redick from really getting into a rhythm, the latter of whom is kind of always going to be in a rhythm. So the Celtics are going to have their hands full. I think it's going to be an exciting series, but I do think that at the end of the day, at this point, the injuries are going to be too much for the Celtics. I have the Sixers in 7, but I really do think the Boston can win this series. I just think it's going to come down to, who can win a game on the road, who can make that statement, especially later on in the series if it gets to that point, who can steal a game and come up with a big play in the fourth quarter on the road. So it'll be really exciting. I'm definitely looking forward to tonight's game 1. And then the final series, which has already gotten started between the Pelicans and the Warriors, Golden State with a very decisive win. Stephen Curry listed as very likely to play tomorrow night. And after the blowout win that the Warriors dealt the Pelicans in game 1, I'd be pretty surprised if New Orleans found a way to win a game once Stephen Curry gets back on the floor. And I think it's just kind of one of those things where it looks like we'll be getting that matchup that everybody's wanted all year between Golden State and Houston. That'll be really, really exciting if that happens. I kind of thought for a while that it wouldn't, but at this point, I don't see what would stop that from happening. I do think the New Orleans can win a game at home. We have seen Golden State go cold at times, and times where they're not as cohesive offensively. But I think that the Western Conference semifinals are going to be a snooze fest for the most part. But in the East, I think it's very possible that we see 6 and 7 game series in both of those matchups. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in for another episode of Pick and Pop. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about the reactions from the Sixers and Celtics tonight, and then a look ahead for the rest of the second round. But that's all I have for you today. Have a good rest of your Monday.